People who express themselves differently and challenge the modern gender norms are often rejected or dehumanized. Centuries ago, before European colonization, people practiced gender expression outside the modern gender binary. Today, this Eurocentric concept has taken over gender norms practiced by uncolonized societies. Some sociologists argue that modern society needs to unlearn that there are two genders, man and woman. According to sociologist and feminist philosopher Maria Lugones, articulating this colonial modern gender system, both in the large strokes and in all its detailed and lived concreteness, will enable us to see what was imposed on us. Now, I want to start talking about gender, how gender is a social construct. And some terms to remember are sex. Sex has to do with your biology, meaning your genitalia or your chromosomes. Gender is more like a set of expectations, like behavior or how you express yourself. Sex assigned at birth is more like what the doctor assigns to you based on your genitalia or your chromosomes. And gender identity is more like how you feel inside and how you want to present to the world. A lot of people confuse that sex and gender are synonymous to each other, but they are not. Another concept important to remember is cisgender. Cisgender is people who identify with their sex assigned at birth. Transgender is another term, which is people who do not identify with the sex assigned at birth. These transgender people can either be male to female, they can be female to male, or they can be non-binary. Non-binary is a person who does not conform to any of the gender binary system that is imposed right now. They don't identify with either male or female. Other thing to remember is gender roles and stereotype. Gender roles is more like how you dressed, how you speak, your behavior, your appearance based on the sex that you were assigned at birth. Some normal gender roles is that men need to be aggressive, they need to be masculine, and they need to be emotionless. Gender roles for women include they need to be feminine, polite, and nurturing. Gender roles affect jobs, clothing, domestic behaviors, and kids' toys. For example, girls should have babies or brooms, and boys should have guns and cars. Now that I talked about sex, gender, and gender identity, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of gender. Before European colonization, gender did not exist. Gender was solely a Western idea. Gender was imposed on colonized territories, for example, Jerusalem, which is in Western Africa. According to sociologist Dr. Oyeronke Oyewumi, in the book The Invention of Women, gender was imposed on Yoruba people after European colonization. The concept of woman in Yoruba society did not exist. So the social hierarchy was solely based on age rather than sex. The gender binary imposed on Yorubaland also gave some rights to men and denied some rights to women, like the ownership of property. Traditional marriages, local marriages in Yorubaland, like non-monogamous marriages, were destroyed, and they were replaced with marriage laws that followed the European Christian model. These societal changes started making women being subordinate to men. According to the book I mentioned before, The Invention of Woman, Dr. Oyumi says the emergence of women as an identifiable category, defined by their anatomy and subordinated to men in all situations, resulted in part from the imposition of a patriarchal colonial state. Another society that was colonized by the Europeans were the Native Americans. Native Americans had many genders pre colonial times. For example, they had a third gender called Two Spirit gender. The Two Spirit people could be either male, female, or intersex people. These people could do weaving, arts, hunting, and warfare. Um, According to an article in the Independent called Two Spirit, Meet the Native Americans Embracing the LGBT plus tribe members, the writer Catherine Davis Young says about Two Spirit people that they are, quote, part of a growing movement among Native Americans who say rigid ideas of gender and sexuality are unfortunate remnants of colonization. Today, Native Americans are starting to embrace a third gender. For example, the Navajo culture has more than three genders. Now that I talked a little bit about the history, I'm going to talk about the gender binary today. More and more people are expressing outside the gender binary today. Challenging gender stereotypes are mainstream. For example, representation in movies, kids' stories, and social media are being seen more often. Educational classes have been added about the LGBTQ plus history, and gender neutral languages in legal documents like government IDs now have an X instead of an M for men or F for female. According to an article in the Houston Chronicle called More People Are Identifying as Trans and Gender Nonconforming Why by Georgia and Davis, the Williams Institute at UCLA says the percentage of transgender adults have doubled in the last 10 years from 0.3% to 0.6%. More people today are embracing the different genders thanks to activists and LGBTQ plus movements. As I said before, people can legally choose their gender in government documents, for example, in driver's licenses. There are more and more TV shows, for example, Euphoria, who has a trans woman, and Sense8, who also has a trans woman as a character. Today I discussed the difference between sex, gender, and gender identity. I also talked briefly about the history of how gender became a product of colonization in places like Yorubaland and Native America. Finally, I discussed how gender is becoming obsolete nowadays. We need to remember that gender is a colonial concept, is a Eurocentric idea imposed on people of color and native peoples in order to control them. It is important to remember also that sex, gender, and gender identity are not the same. Today, the gender binary of men and women is widely practiced in places that have been victims of European colonization. It is important to remember that these social constructs are rooted in European colonization. The binary gender system is ever changing today. And more people are embracing the idea of living outside the modern gender binary system. People are expressing as they feel inside themselves and outside the gender binary. Thanks for watching.